Hello and welcome to My Community, your weekly program that allows Barbadians to share the rich history, culture and traditions of their communities and so enrich our lives. I am Miles Eversley. A very warm welcome to our viewers around the world, those of you who continue to follow us weekly via the World Wide Web. In this week's program, we skip across borders to the parish of St. Michael, and through the eyes of Tessa Chaderton-Shaw, we see aspects of life on a plantation where she grew up. Exactly where are we, Tessa?
We're actually on the periphery of the Belle Plantation yard, Belle Plantation, and this is where I lived in the formative years of my life. I would say from about age 2 till about age 10, and my parents and I, plus 3 sisters, lived on the top floor of this house that lots of people would see as they drive past on the highway. So what we see here today with the ABC highway actually slicing through the Belle Plantation is very different to when I lived here. There was no highway, there was just an extensive expanse of land planted with sugarcane and other crops, and it extended as far as the tower that we see in the distance at Roberts Manufacturing. And you know, historical records tell us that in 1915 the Belle Plantation comprised 583 acres of land, so pretty extensive landscape for production. So we're actually standing at the back of the factory building itself, and we're standing on a bridge that is over a gully and what would be a section of the Belle Gully. When we have heavy rainfall, this is an area that even today when we get heavy rainfall, the road is sometimes becomes impassable. But if you look down, you will see the depth of the gully, and which really needs to be cleared now that we're in hurricane season. So this is a metal bridge that is in a terrible state of decay, but this will be one of the tributaries of the Constitution River that would take water from the hills into the city. My father was an assistant manager of the Belle Plantation, and of course we lived here during the pre-independence period from around 1961 to 1970, because at that time I attended Hilltop Preparatory School. In fact, my mother reminds me that I first went to St. Gabriel's School from this house, and I would tell her that I wasn't learning anything, and she removed me after about, I think, the first year, and then I went to Hilltop Preparatory, which was operated by Ina and Olga Jordan, now deceased. Hilltop Preparatory is in the Welch's St. Michael area. However, as I stand here, and whenever I am on this compound at the Belle Plantation, I have vivid memories of my childhood, memories that bring back senses of taste and smell and people and sights and sounds. Because there was I, as a child, as I said, in my formative years, living in a plantation setting. Of course, in those days, sugar was king. And I have very vivid memories of what they would call crop time, when the factory, which is now not in its original state, but the building still exists. And you know, to my rear, you will see parts of the factory and the windmill. But around February, the factory would get into gear. At that time, the manager of the factory was a Mr. Harding. Interestingly enough, Mr. Harding and his wife was Sylvia, and they had 2 daughters. And later we will look at the house that they occupied. They lived in what is called the Great House. My father, being the under manager or second in command, occupied a smaller house and just one floor. On the ground floor, another overseer lived. And I remember a Mr. Gay who came from Curacao. I knew the word Curacao very early in my life. Mr. Gay, there was a Mr. Bannister, there was a Mr. Mahon, there was a Mr. Goodin who was the factory manager. And I lived in a very interesting world that combined animals, cows and mules and horses, and the workers on the plantation, who at that time were called laborers. It was a very different reality, but that is what it was at the time. My father worked very hard. I remember him in his khaki uniform, long pants, long sleeve shirt, and a cork hat. And as I reflect on this, I was wondering, gosh, that must have been hot. But that was his dress every day. Behind me is one of two windmills here at the Belle Plantation. And we're seeing the base of the windmill. And what is interesting about this particular windmill is that my dad and the other overseers would pay the workers from their little office, and circular steps hugged the mill wall, and the laborers, as they would call, would go to receive their pay packets on Friday afternoons. Everything, of course, was manually done. There were huge ledgers with detailed information about who did what and how much, how much rows of cane were planted or cut, or how many of X ground provision was reaped. But that is where they were. That was their office. So he was responsible for the production of sugar, and the Belle Plantation at one point in time consisted of 583 acres of land. And I think it's interesting for Barbadians to know that at the turn of the 20th century, specifically in 1915, there were 1,000 plantations in Barbados. They would later become, as things changed and we came out of the emancipation period and into a more modern era, those plantations were sold off. However, the Belle Plantation was always in the Harewood Lascelles family. Gerald Lascelles was the owner of the Belle Plantation at the time that I lived here. And as we go inside, I think you will get a better perspective of the original factory yard. And unfortunately, its beautiful original state is now somewhat dilapidated in some areas, and it also consists now of more modern commercial properties. Surrounding this house and this property were acres and acres of sugar cane. In fact, another vivid recollection that I have is of a fire that engulfed the Belle Plantation, and as a child, I thought that the house would catch on fire. The entire surroundings was in flames during the day, and I remember I can hear the crackling sound of cane being burnt.
Memories don't leave like people do. Speaking of which, as with any Barbadian upbringing, food usually evokes fond memories.
I have vivid memories of food that I would have eaten here. For example, at that time, people didn't go out and buy dessert. You had homemade dessert. And one of the things my mother made was green pawpaw that was boiled in syrup. A lot of things that we ate and drank sort of were products or byproducts of sugarcane. So I can tell you about swank, which is a cold drink that we often drank, a mixture of syrup, lime juice, and water, and that was very refreshing. I can tell you about cracked liquor, which is something that my father would bring home in these gallon bottles, and it was hot from the factory, and we really enjoyed the cracked liquor as well. So apart from green pawpaw and cracked liquor and swank, I remember an incident when, and I hate to use the word, but this is what they were called. It's something that a lot of Barbadians had planted around their properties, and it was called nigger peppers. And these were very tiny, red, and extremely hot peppers. And my mother used to preserve them in a mixture with vinegar, but somehow I got my fingers in the preparation and into my eyes. And I just remember being at the kitchen door and crying and this burning sensation, and my father coming home, you know, hot and sweaty from day's work, and washing out my eyes and telling me, never touch these nigger peppers again.
Now, earlier in the program, Tessa mentioned the great house at the Belle Plantation where the estate manager resided. She takes us for a look at this property and entertains us with the tale of Queen Elizabeth II's visit to Barbados on the 15th of February, 1966.
So I'm standing smack in the middle of the Belle Plantation's yard. To my right is the original factory building, and this factory was once powered by steam, but standing behind me is the great house, and many of us would hear about various great houses, which were the homes of the estate owners or the managers. And as I said earlier, Mr. Hardin occupied this house with his wife and 2 daughters. It's very unfortunate that the house is in such a dilapidated state today, because it was a very beautiful building, very beautiful old estate home. And this area was essentially my playground. To my extreme left, you see various, a shed of sorts which would have housed machinery, but also animals, and it was used for storage. And you note the construction of the shed with its roof, which is sort of touching the doors of the building. So right here we have a mixture of old and new. And of course I remember the old features of this property. The highlight of my life during that 9-10 year period here at the Belle Plantation was the visit of Queen Elizabeth II on the 15th of February 1966, because she was on a royal tour of the Caribbean and was visiting 15 islands plus British Guyana, BG as it was called in those days. Actually, Barbados was her first stop, and she was on the Royal Britannica. I was 6 years old at the time. Of course, I now date myself, but what was very special for me is the entire preparation for the Queen's visit to the Belle Plantation. I recall, and I can actually feel the texture of the dress that I wore. Everything had to be pristine. And the dress that I wore, which is a white dress that had, you know, features of blue and red, came from Guyana. It was a dress bought in Guyana. In those days, my grandfather, Captain Eric Hassel, sailed between Guyana and Barbados, and my mother must have asked him to buy a dress for Tessa. And there was I bedecked in this beautiful, it was a sort of heavy material, but I had this beautiful dress on, and my hair was immaculately curled by my mother. I recall my mother dipping a comb in a cup of water and ensuring that all of my curls were perfectly formed. My shoes, and you will see these in photographs, were as white as snow, and so were my socks. So this was a big day for a 6-year-old. Here she was being asked to present a bouquet of flowers to the queen. And when she approached me, and of course I had to curtsy, she asked me, "Are these beautiful flowers for me?" And I said, "Yes, Queen Elizabeth II." Again, I speak through the eyes of a 6-year-old. I didn't know any better, but it was a very historic moment in my life, and it's only now as I reflect on it that I recognize the importance of that occasion.
Yes, we don't usually give thought to the importance of moments like these in the instant, rather realizing it with the passing of time. Tessa continues to reminisce about the social life on the estate.
Living in a factory and a plantation setting, during crop time, the siren of the factory was something that we often heard, and I recall it going off like 6 p.m. and again like 12 noon. I think that there were obviously shifts, but the sound of that factory and the factory itself in production mode, it was a very active time on the plantation. So I'm seeing this plantation through the eyes of a child, very differently to I am today, fully understanding the sugar economy, which was extremely productive at a certain point in time, and is now on its decline. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Barbados once had 1,000 sugar plantations. We have, I believe, one now in operation, Port Vale factory in St. James. But when we think about the history of this entire sugar economy, and as I have matured and read and grown in my understanding, there were many different worlds colliding here. A white plantocracy, overseers and managers from different walks of life, but the brunt of the work being done by black workers who came from the surrounding neighborhood of Belle Gully and My Lord's Hill and Waterford Bottom and Lower Estate. The Belle Plantation was owned by the Harewood family. In fact, from 1648 to 1975, the Harewood family and generations of the Harewoods and the Lascelles family had interests in sugar production in Barbados, most significantly, but also in Jamaica, and I believe it was Antigua. So they owned a lot of plantations, and it is said that that is how they accrued their wealth. And the reason for the Queen's visit to this particular plantation was because the owner at the time, Gerald Lascelles, who was the 6th Earl of Harewood, was the Queen's first cousin. So you see the close connection between the Harewoods and the Lascelles family to royalty. Now, behind me is a piece of machinery from the factory. These are various wheels that would have been used to generate sugar. And I recall as a child going into the factory, and I had to be accompanied by an adult, but I recall these huge wheels turning and the hissing sound of steam and large vats of sugar cane in its various stages as it was boiled to make sugar and then into syrup. I also have vivid memories of something called bagasse. And I don't think many of our young people today would have any appreciation of bagasse. And bagasse was the byproduct of the squeezed sugar cane, and it was put out into the sun to dry, and it was used as fuel as well. But I remember just wanting to jump into the pile of bagasse but then you would get this itching sensation. So this was a very active um, space. This was where my childhood was lived, and it's a very beautiful area just north of My Lord's Hill, and there are lovely mahogany trees on this property and on surrounding areas. Another recollection I have, and as I said, not only was sugar produced here and syrup and its byproducts, but there was also a time when ground provisions, things like eddos and yams and dashins would be planted. And I would see the laborers, especially the women, with their dung baskets. And they often had a large piece of cloth on their heads to protect their heads from the weight of what they were bearing. Of course, these were very difficult times. And I must tell you that one thing that I remember very vividly in terms of my parents and their interaction with people who worked on the plantation is that respect was always due to people who worked on the plantation. I had to respect them regardless of their station in life. I was raised that way, and that was inculcated in me by my father. He would often work late on evenings, and he often took people home in a Land Rover into places like the Bell Gully and Waterford Bottom, Lower Estate, and surrounding communities, which at that time, many of them were called tenantries. I think he also disliked the suffering that many of these people endured because they had to work hard. There are people that I remember, Norma Wiggins, who worked with us as a housekeeper. And as a child, and it was, as I reflect, it's interesting how I was called Miss Tessa. That was the respect that she was showing to me even though I was a child. I remember a gentleman called Taylor, and he was responsible for the mules. And actually, on the day of the Queen's visit, Taylor is in the yard with a dray cart and one of the mules to show the Queen, you know, some of the animals on the plantation at the time. So I have very vivid memories of a very disciplined childhood here in this house. Actually, we used to spend a lot of time in the patio. I also vividly recall another gentleman who was like a handyman. His nickname was Blacksmith. He was not a blacksmith, but I could see his black boots and the denim, sort of denim shirt and pants that he wore. And he would often bring me my cow, because I had a cow called Daisy. Daisy was a beautiful brown and white cow. Life was simple. I don't recall having friends visiting. Life was simple. It was surrounded by a plantation and its inner workings, but discipline and respect for the people who surrounded me was key. In a sense, as an adult, as I reflect on that time, I also recognize that I was caught in two worlds. I was caught in between two worlds because Mr. Hardin was a white Barbadian. I don't recall ever going to his house, but we never fraternized. I'm caught between two worlds because I was never seen as visibly white nor visibly black. But one thing that my family and I always understood is that respect for humankind and respect for people, regardless of their station in life, was due.
These are the dynamics which play out in many of our lives on a daily basis. However, that respect serves as an essential mediator in our interaction. Thank you, Tessa. Stories of Barbadian communities as told by her people. Be sure to take care of yourselves and look out for the interests of your neighbors. Until next time, I am Miles Eversley. Goodbye.